We have with us Dr. Arnaud Develay, a political analyst from Damascus. Sir, thank you for your time. Dr. Arnaud Develay, the U.S. has sanctioned the Syrian officials, saying the curbs will promote accountability for abuses committed against the Syrian people. Do you think the Syrian government is committing human rights crime against its own people?
Well, one has to keep in mind that there's been a systematic campaign to demonize the Syrian and legitimate Syrian government for years now. The so-called Caesar file, which actually paved the way for the passing of this U.S. law, domestic U.S. law, I should add, allowing for sanctions against any countries who might engage in some kind of transaction with the Syrian government, and so on a matter of humanitarian ground as well, has always been debunked as an operation led by the humanitarian NGO complex, i.e. in this case, Amnesty International. This is something that is savantly organized by the neoconservative and liberal interventionist crowd in Washington. And they've been at it, using media, NGO complex, and by manipulating as well the United Nations agencies, such as the Organization for the Control of Chemical Weapons. So this is nothing new. And in this instance, it's just yet another example of this attrition war, hybrid warfare that is being waged not as much on the Syrian government and or Syrian officials, but against the Syrian people.
Right. Dr. Develay, what do Washington want to gain with the latest curbs, as it has already sanctioned the Syrian government?
Well, the objective is always stated as such, basically that by putting pressure on the Syrian officials and Syrian organs of the state, they are trying to basically prevent the state, the Syrian state, from attending to its citizens' needs. And the hope is that over the long run, public opinion in Syria, but also in other countries where those sanction regimes are being imposed, the population will turn against their elected officials. And I want to remind our viewers that we've had a presidential election a couple of months ago, which was a ringing endorsement by the Syrian people of the way President Bashar Al-Assad has handled and presided over the waging of the war of liberation from terrorism. So those attempts to try to drive a wedge between Syrian people, regular people, and its leadership will fail ultimately. So in the end, as former UK ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, said, we are really witnessing nothing more than a spiteful policy which aims at cruelly rendering ordinary Syrians' lives miserable and nothing else.
Dr. Develay, the Biden administration is pulling all American troops out of Afghanistan and Iraq, but the U.S. military operation in Syria has seen no changes. Why do the U.S. want to linger on in its presence in Syria?
As for your question on Syria, the Syria group that has been specially appointed upon President Biden's inauguration have openly claimed that their role is to basically remain in Syria for the oil as a means of pressure to prevent any kind of reconstruction and to put pressure on Syrian government to basically obtain through economic sanction what they could not obtain through the means of terrorism. So Syria has won the war militarily, and now becomes a new chapter. It's a new chapter which bears on economic sanctions, on diplomatic pressure, and basically on trying to prevent any reconstruction to take place. But by no means the situation is that different between Syria and Iraq, or between Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. I would say that specifically to Syria and Iraq, the main things for the American is to try to contain what they call Iranian influence. They believe that, and in order to protect their, proxy state, Israeli state, in the region, they need to maintain a presence in the region to prevent what they perceive as Iranian influence filling the vacuum if they were to leave. So there's no way the Americans are going to be leaving the regions anytime soon. If anything, they are reactivating as we speak terrorist cells. They are trying to break the lack of porosity of the border between Iraq and Syria, which has early on in the last decade, allowed them to wreak havoc, essentially, by facilitating the ins and outs of terrorists under their care and training and control, should I say.
Dr. Arnaud Devolay, thank you for speaking to Indus News.